Hello. This is a video that I've been wanting to make for about a year now, and I've also sat down to record this many times over, but I keep on just kind of needing to start over. I just keep on not knowing how to say what I want to say. But I feel like this is something that needs to be said, so I am going to do my best to say it, and hopefully this will be the final take. But the recent murder of George Floyd and others has brought starkly into the public attention the brutal and terrible way that people of color in general, but especially Black people, have been treated in the world in general, but especially in the United States over the last several centuries. And first of all, it's terrible. Terrible. I'm sorry if I'm laughing. It's not because I think any of this is funny. I just kind of have a tendency of laughing when I'm nervous. It's terrible that it took many murders to bring this to the public attention, and I'm completely guilty in that, because although I did want to make this video earlier, I was too afraid to until now. I didn't do it until now. But it's brought the terrible treatment of Black people really starkly into contrast, or into view, and it's causing a lot of white people to have to think, which is a really good thing. And it's also caused a lot of talk and debate within the costuming community, because quite frankly, many of the eras that we in this community hold dear were terrible in their treatment of Black people. And it's caused us to stop and think, by doing this, are we condoning that? And I mean, I dress like this every day, so it's really made me stop and think, am I condoning this terrible treatment of people in the past? And I've heard of people, just leaving the costuming community because they feel that they can't continue doing this sort of thing. But I do not think that this is the answer. I don't think it's the answer to leave the costuming community, and I don't think it's the answer for me to change my style of dressing. And I'm not going to go into explicitly why I'm not going to change my style of dressing, because I don't want to make this video about me. And if I go into my reasons for that, then I think it will be making it about me, but I'm just going to talk about why it's important that we not give up on the costume community in general, and those, I think, reasons also apply to why I'm making the decision to continue dressing in the way that I enjoy dressing. And really what it comes down to, Kathy Hay released a video recently, and she also pretty much came to this conclusion, is that this is a conversation that needs to be had. And just giving up on this community and just leaving and giving up on the past and saying it's racist, so therefore I won't, is a fantastic way for white people to avoid having to have this conversation. And I don't think that that's acceptable. We need to acknowledge, certainly, we need to acknowledge the terrible ways in which Black people were treated in the past, and we also need to acknowledge the terrible ways in which Black people are being treated now. That's another thing. I feel as though if we just leave the costuming community and say, oh, it was racist back then, so therefore I'm leaving because I can't support that, that is tantamount to saying people back then were racist, but we've gone beyond that now. By leaving the costuming community because it's racist and then coming into just doing modern stuff, that's saying, I can't condone that because people back then were racist. So that means you can condone what's going on now. And I don't want to put words into people's mouths, but that is kind of the underlying message. And there is a tendency to really pat ourselves on the back for how much we've evolved over our ancestors. I've talked about this in many of my feminist videos, and this is coming up again here. Clearly, we have not come very far since the late 19th century. Because if we had, George Floyd would still be alive. And it would take a very, very stupid person to argue that You know, black people in the 1900s, 1890s, in the past, were treated exactly the same as they are today. No, I'm not saying that at all. I am fully aware that racism was far more the norm in the past than it is now, and that it was much more institutionalized and built into the system than it is now. And I'm fully aware of that. It would take an absolute idiot to argue that that was not the case. But by just abandoning this costuming community, it's getting us as white people out of having to have this conversation and saying, well, I'm just going to come to this modern world where everything's fine. So it shuts the conversation down. And it ignores not only the way that black people are treated nowadays, but the fact that many modern clothes are still made by people who are operating in slave conditions. The fast fashion industry, I'm not going to cover this because Bernadette Banner has gone over a whole thing. But it really shuts down this conversation that needs to be had. So, yeah, I don't feel that leaving this community is the right thing to do. That said, there are things that we do need to do. We need to be as welcoming as possible to people of all races and all backgrounds, especially of people of color and black people. And when I say that, I don't mean that we haven't done our best to be welcoming to everybody. I've not seen any overt racism, but if there's anything that, I mean, that's not true. But one of the things that I've learned, when I said that's not true, I was referring to it when I was about to say if there's anything that I've learned from this whole thing, and that's what's not true. One of the things that I've learned from, and although I've never seen any overt racism in the costuming community, one of the things that I have learned from this whole situation is that it doesn't take a burning cross to make a person racist. I personally have never set out with the intention of oppressing anybody, but just my existence as a white woman, a relatively privileged white woman, is oppressive. And I've benefited from an oppressive system. And that is something that all white people need to acknowledge. And of course, acknowledging is just the first step. We can't just say, yes, we've benefited from your oppression, now have a good day. We need to acknowledge it and then work to rectify it. But acknowledging is the first step. That is something that all white people need to acknowledge, and that is something that especially needs to be done in the costuming community. If you're making, for example, a Civil War era dress out of cotton, you need to acknowledge where that cotton came from. If you're doing something suffragette related, you need to acknowledge that the suffragette movement in America, and I'm very much including myself in this because I've talked a lot about the suffragettes and I've never brought this up. The suffragette movement in America was wildly racist. It was despicable. Black women were kept out of pretty much all suffrage anything. When black women started working for the vote, they had to start at square one. And of course there are some exceptions. Obviously, I don't like to make blanket statements. Sojourner Truth, who is an absolute hero, I absolutely adore her. She worked hand in hand with Susan B. Anthony. So did Harriet Tubman. They worked together. So it's not, again, I don't want to make black and white statements, but for the most part, the suffrage movement in America was intensely racist. And that is something that I have not been very good about acknowledging. So I feel as though if we make an effort to acknowledge the backgrounds to some of these things that we love, it will hopefully make people feel more welcomed and more acknowledged. I also believe that it's okay to admire and to love the good and the beautiful things about the 19th century, because just as it would take a remarkably stupid person to argue that, black people were treated fine in the 19th century, or that black people in the 19th century were treated just as they are now, it would also take a remarkably stupid person to argue that the 19th century was objectively bad. And when I say 19th century, I mean pretty much all of history. The 19th century was objectively bad, because there were some very good and very beautiful things to come out of the 19th century. Things like the abolitionist movement, things like, as racist and as bigoted as the women's suffrage movement was, it was still an amazing movement. And just physically beautiful things. I mean, yes, the clothing of the 19th century and the architecture and the furniture, it was beautiful. And we can acknowledge that these things are beautiful, I think, as long as we also acknowledge that many of them were soaked in blood. And there's a difference between glorifying everything about the past. To say everything was just so much better back then, or to even say, so what am I trying to say? I had it in my head and now it's gone. But to say something along the lines of clothing back then was better, is not okay. You can say, but to say something along the lines of clothing back then was very, very beautiful, and I think that it is absolutely gorgeous, but also many unethical practices went into making it, is, in my opinion, okay, because I'm also speaking as a white woman, a relatively privileged white woman, so I mean, I could be completely wrong. If I'm wrong, tell me. And I also don't want to be, the white woman saying, black people, dedicate all of your time and effort to teaching me, because that's what you need to be doing. I don't. But if you do happen to stumble across this video and you are a person of color and you do feel inclined to let me know, I would love to have your input. I don't want to imply that it is your duty to give me input. But what I'm basically trying to say is that we can love and admire the good as long as we also acknowledge the bad. And also the idea that, the past was racist, therefore I cannot make clothing that is, in the style of the past, is exclusionary, in my opinion, because that makes it seem as though there were no black people in the past. And there were of course black people. Every kind of person that there is now, there was in the past. And they dressed, if they were in America, they dressed just like this. A black woman in the 1890s would have worn she would have had pretty much exactly the same silhouette that I have. So I think that I keep on coming back to this, it's very important to acknowledge not only the blood-soaked history of everything, and to acknowledge the fact that many of the things that we love are soaked in blood, but to also acknowledge that this country and this world has always been incredibly diverse, and we are diverse whether we're wearing corsets and top hats or whether we're wearing jeggings and what do men wear today? Jean jackets. My point is, we've always been incredibly diverse, and the clothing that we wear doesn't change that. So I hope this has made sense. I hope that I haven't come off as being preachy, because it was not my intention to, point anybody in the costuming community out and say, you are not doing good enough. that was not my intention. My intention was to kind of send a message to the costuming community as a whole. And I'm certainly not counting myself as being, you know, I'm doing it right and you all need to be doing what I'm doing, because that's not true. I've certainly been very insensitive to this in the past, and I'm insensitive to it now, but I am trying. And again, if I'm totally wrong, please let me know. But this is my 2 cents, that we need to have these conversations. They're going to be painful, but we need to have them, and we can't shy away from them. And we can have these conversations and still continue doing the things that we love. And if we do that, then this community will be bigger and happier and more joyful and more inclusive and better. Love one another and acknowledge the blood-soaked history of white privilege. So I hope that this video made sense. I will have this very often where I'll be very excited and ready to talk about something, and then I'll turn on the camera and I'll just kind of, and I won't know what to say. This has happened with many of my feminist videos as well. But so I hope this made sense, and if I've offended anybody, I'm very sorry. That's not my intention. And if I am completely wrong or partially wrong, let me know. Thank you for watching, and I hope you stick around. Bye.